everyone, this is Emma. Welcome to session 8 of the course. In session 6, we introduced qualitative research methods, and we talked about two key data collection methods, which are focus groups and in-depth interviews. In this session, we'll introduce another set of key qualitative methods, which are observation and ethnography. And then we'll also spend time at the end talking about standards that are used for assessing quality in qualitative research. So let's start with observation. Observation as a method has its origins in the fields of anthropology and sociology. It involves learning through watching, listening, and interacting in the field, and making systematic notes about your experiences. So the field in this case refers to the physical and social spaces related to your research question. That could be neighborhoods, it could be community centers, households, etc. Observation helps us understand topics in their natural context and topics that go beyond people's accounts or experiences. So this includes things like complex interactions that are hard to describe verbally, subconscious behaviors, people's relationships with their environments, or any issue where there's pressure to conform so that what people say may differ from their actual behaviors. The type of observation varies by the degree of researcher participation. So the first type here on the slide is complete participant, and this is the most intensive type of observation. It involves the researcher trying to become a member of the group being studied and concealing their role as researcher or observer. So an example would be someone working as a server in a restaurant and not disclosing that they're conducting research on the health of restaurant workers. Complete participant observation is useful when the aim is to achieve an insider view, and it requires the ability and resources, of course, to remain part of a community for a sustained amount of time. Participant as observer is essentially participation while observing. So in this scenario, the researcher's status is made clear, but the aim is to become close with participants and to observe by participating in group activities. So an example would be working as a volunteer alongside staff in a food pantry, but making it known that you're there for purposes of research. Observer as participant, that's the third type of researcher participation, is observing in a way that does not intrude, or engaging in a setting to some extent, but usually for short periods and sometimes only once. So an example of that would be conducting observation in a clinical setting, or maybe in a classroom. So people know that you're there to observe, but you're not actively participating in the activity. Finally, we have complete observer, and that's when the researcher remains completely detached and their presence is usually not known. So, for example, observation in a public space, or sometimes through a two-way mirror. And an assumption with this type of observation is that the researcher's presence makes little difference to what they are observing. An important feature of observation pertains to the presence of the researcher. So the presence of the researcher influences to varying degrees what is observed and how it's interpreted. Perception is relative, right? When we look at the same scene or the same object, different people will see different things. And this co-production of data between the researcher and the people and the scenes they're observing is part of what makes observation data so rich. The sociologist Bob Emerson makes this point when he says writing field notes isn't so much passively copying down facts, but rather it's an active process of interpretation and sense-making. So related to this, there's some debate over the ethics of covert versus overt observation, and whether consent is needed in all types of observation. A general rule of thumb, though, is that it's acceptable to observe in public spaces without explicit permission, because of this assumption that if you're in a public space, you know that you can be observed really by anyone who's there. So what are some of the purposes of observation? Well, one purpose is for familiarizing yourself with a given topic. So it can be useful to conduct observation at the start of a study to orient yourself to an issue, and it can help the researcher grasp complexity of a topic and to narrow the focus of the research question. It can also be used in a more focused way to observe processes that are most relevant to your research question. Observation can be used on its own, though it's more frequently used in combination with other qualitative methods. And some of the reasons you might use observation in multi-method study designs are to identify themes to then explore in spoken accounts like interviews or focus groups, to verify what has been said in interviews. You might use observation to explain or describe how something that respondents discussed is carried out in practice, right? What does it look like in real life? You might use observation to provide an understanding of the physical context in which practices, behaviors, or interactions are carried out. And you might use it to help explain apparent inconsistencies in spoken accounts. You can also use observation to study online interactions. And the advantages of this are that you can sometimes gain access to communities of interest more easily than you would in the physical world. So say, for example, you're interested in the experiences of cancer survivors. You could go directly to an online support group and find the people you're interested in. You can also study online and social media phenomena, and observation of online interactions can provide access to hidden behaviors, ones that people are less likely to perform in public spaces. So the nature of the data in this type of observation is different, right? It would be in the form of written words, audio records, images, but the researcher's role in shaping and interpreting data or co-producing data is similar to observation of physical interactions. And as with observation in private spaces, informed consent is required for observing private online communities. So there are several dimensions of observation that need to be planned beforehand. First, you need to decide what to observe, right? Unfortunately, it's not possible to observe every single thing. And the dimensions of observation usually include the physical setting, the human setting, interactional setting, and the program setting. Another thing to plan is where you will observe. Is it a specific setting, like a health clinic, or is it multiple settings, like people's homes or workplaces, or places where people socialize? Another thing is time frame. You should consider the time of day, the time of week, and the time of year if it has implications for your research question. So for example, if we were interested in how people use public spaces for physical exercise, we would ideally observe public spaces at different times of the day and the week and in different seasons to see how those factors influence use of the space. Another factor to consider is the predictability of the phenomenon you're interested in. So for example, if you're interested in interactions between health providers and patients, you could conduct observations whenever patient visits are scheduled, right? But say you're interested in understanding how people with physical disabilities access public transport. You might have to plan to observe, at bus stops or in subway stations for a longer period of time and maybe on multiple occasions to make sure that you capture the moments you're interested in. So field notes are the object of analysis in observation. That's what you're analyzing. And field notes can be more or less structured depending on the topic, and this is something that you should decide in advance of fieldwork. Field notes should include everything you think is worth noting. Usually that should include specific and really detailed descriptions, what people say with quotes where possible, your feelings and reflections on what you're observing, and your interpretations. And it's recommended that you distinguish observations from your own reflections in some way that you'll understand when you go back afterwards. For example, using brackets around your reflections. Observation can also include photography and or video. So photos are really useful for capturing still images of the environment, who is present or any other important aspects of the setting. Video is more appropriate when the research question involves actions or interactions. And you can use video for analysis, but you can also use it as a tool to discuss with participants. In observation, we use data collection forms, and these help the researcher remember to note key dimensions of an interaction and setting. And they can help structure field notes so that they have some consistency across setting and also across researchers if you're working in a team. So this example here is adapted from a study by Brady and colleagues at the UK National Children's Bureau, and they were looking at opportunities for physical activity among preschool children. So the data collection form captures narrative information about the setting, the child's behaviors, their interactions with others, and the researcher's own thoughts and reflections. And it gave a structure that the researcher could organize their notes with and add comments or diagrams to that they considered important. So data collection forms can be highly structured. You can have checklists of, really particular activities that you're observing and timesheets to record the duration of those activities. Or they can be less structured with more open-ended narrative notes on specific themes, like what you see here in this example. So we'll end this section by talking about an example of a study that used observation. This was conducted by William White and his research team in the 70s, and they were interested in what made certain urban public spaces more appealing than others, right? Why is it that some public plazas are almost completely empty, while others are filled with people? And what the implications were for making cities more livable places. So they conducted structured observation and took video recordings of parks, plazas, and other urban spaces in New York City. And they noted specific characteristics of the physical environment, but they also paid attention to the ways people interacted with each other and with the space at different times of day and week. So the study was really simple in its design, but it really revolutionized urban planning. And it has quite a bit of resonance for public health, as our field has embraced the importance of the built environment for facilitating healthy behaviors.